This is a 1995 Toyota MR2 Turbo, and it's a mid-engine turbocharged rear-wheel drive sports car with a manual transmission. This car would never get built today, especially by Toyota, who makes the world's ugliest electric crossover. But today, we're going to take a trip back in time, and I'm going to review the MR2 Turbo and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this MR2 Turbo is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a really nice SW20 Turbo in the best color from the final model year, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this MR2 Turbo, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of this MR2 Turbo, starting with a little overview of the MR2, which was a compact Toyota sports car that they made for quite a while, actually. The original model, the first generation, enthusiasts call it the AW11, and it was sold basically throughout the 1980s. This version is the second generation MR2. They call it the SW20, and it came out for the 91 model year here in the US, and it was sold through 95. Now, in this period, Toyota was making three different sporty performance cars. The MR2, the Celica, which was a similar size but not quite as focused, but still sporty and cool, and then the Supra at the top of the lineup. It was a totally different time, a totally different era. And in fact, after this MR2 went away in 95, they never really replaced it with another one. In 2000, Toyota came out with the MR2 Spider, which had sort of a similar ethos, but it wasn't as fast, it wasn't as focused. It was more of a kind of relaxed, fun convertible car instead of a true sports car like this one. And even then, the MR2 Spider only lasted for a few years before Toyota gave it the axe, and they haven't been back to a car like this since. Now, the MR2 gets its name from, well, basically what it is. Mid-engine, rear-wheel drive car with two seats. MR2. Pretty simple. And you can see the mid-engine right here. Now, this version of the MR2 was offered with a choice between two powertrains. The base model, the standard MR2, used a naturally aspirated four-cylinder that made 130 horsepower. But if you stepped up to this one, the Turbo, you got a twin turbocharged four-cylinder that made 200 horsepower, which was a pretty significant upgrade over that base level 130. Now, this engine is known as the 3S GTE, and it's a famous powertrain, which was also offered on another Toyota sold in America. The original Celica GT4 had it in the early 90s. Not the later Celica GT4 that was so desirable and cool. They never sold that here, but from like 90 to 93, the Celica GT4 sold here with this engine. And as you can see, if you look closely at the engine, twin entry turbo is printed there. Turbocharging hadn't really become that mainstream, and the naming around what stuff was hadn't even really been standardized. This car was a pretty big deal with its turbo engine. Now, as for transmissions, Toyota offered a choice between a 5-speed manual or a 4-speed automatic on the base MR2, but if you stepped up to the Turbo, you were getting a 5-speed manual only. That's the only way this car came. But anyway, moving on to the quirks and features of the SW20, starting with the fact that this car has a lot of stuff that opens or removes. For example, there are two trunks. This car is only 3 inches longer than a Honda Fit, but it has two trunks. There's one in back in the normal location. You open it with a little latch in the driver footwell where a normal trunk latch would be. You come back here, lift it up, and it's a quite large trunk, as you can see. Decent space, surprisingly practical. It's a neat trick considering that the rear of this car also contains the engine. Now, to get into the engine compartment, there's another latch. This time it's behind the driver's seat. You can see on the driver's side of the car, you pull this latch, that opens the engine compartment. And you can have the engine compartment and the trunk open separately. They don't collide with each other like they do on some cars. Now, because the engine is back here, of course, there is also space up front where you have another trunk. To get to that, it's like a standard engine compartment latch under the dashboard on the driver's side. You pull it, then you open up this front trunk, and you can see more space up here. Obviously, it contains the spare tire, but there's more space in addition to that, so you can put, well, more stuff in this car, making it relatively practical considering what it is. But while the front of this car opens and the rear of this car opens and the rear middle of this car opens, we're not done yet because the roof also comes off. This car has T-tops and you can take off the roof. And in fact, the roof is quite a quirk in this vehicle, so let's get to it. On the outside, you can see glass roof panels separated by this line in the middle, two different glass roof panels. But on the inside, well, there's a headliner, like a carpeted headliner like you'd see in basically any car. You can stick that on there if you don't want the sun to come through the glass panels, but you can remove the headliner, just twist this little screw, it pops off, and then take it away, and now you're bathed in sun but through the glass. If you want to be even more in touch with the world, you can remove the glass panels themselves. There's this little switch here which unlocks the ability to open this larger latch. When you do that, the top is unlocked and you can pull the panel off on that side of the car. Now, interestingly, as you can see, there's also a locking component, like a key lock here. So I guess you could, in theory, key lock your roof in place so that nobody else opens it from the inside. Which is rather unusual, but it is possible. Maybe they were concerned about theft of these panels if you parked somewhere and left the windows down. Well, you don't have that problem. But once you pull off both panels, you can see it creates kind of a convertible experience. They called it T-tops back in the day. It gave you something of an open roof, wind in your hair experience. Although it wasn't technically a traditional convertible with a cloth top that you could put down. However, Toyota did make a small handful of these MR2s with a real convertible top. It was called the MR Spider, and it was made in conjunction with a company called Technocraft, who handled most of the roof architecture. They only made maybe 90 or so of these, all for the Japanese market, so they're all right-hand drive. We actually sold one of these on Cars and Bids not that long ago. They are rare and special cars, the true convertible experience. But even in the normal standard MR2, you got some of that. And of course, when you wanted the roof to go back on, well, you could just put it back on. You just stick it in place and then follow the reverse procedure, latching it shut, and then your roof is back on. And if you wanted the headliner to go back on too, you could do that as well. It gave you the ability to have a full closed roof or a sunroof or an open convertible top. It's pretty cool, actually. By the way, one other interesting item on the subject of the T-tops, when you pull them off, this little panel pops up above the windshield frame. That's a wind deflector. You pull off the T-top and it's spring-loaded, so the wind deflector pops up automatically on both sides, driver and passenger, as you can see, in order to keep, well, wind from blowing in the cabin. I guess just that little deflector is enough to do the job. Very interesting to see that little piece. I bet most people have no idea it's there on the MR2. But anyway, while the opening stuff with this car is interesting and quirky, we are not done with the exterior quirks just yet. Next, we move on to the VIN etching, which you see on the glass, and I mean all of the glass contains an etched VIN that matches the VIN of this car. Every piece of glass, including the T-tops, actually have the matching VIN on the glass. They did this back back in the day, dealers would sell you VIN etching as an upgrade. It was an extra cost, and the thought was it would prevent theft. And you can even see the little logo for Toyo Guard on this MR2. This sticker has stayed in place for all these years to warn thieves. This car is equipped with VIN etching, so don't try to steal it and strip it for parts or whatever they thought you might do. It's interesting to see it now. But anyway, other cool quirks on the outside. One thing I've always loved, the taillights. You got these dual circles on each side. So basically quad taillight circles, which is a really, really cool look. And in the center, you got MR2 flanked by the reverse lights. It was a very distinctive taillight, turn signal, reverse light design in the back of this car. I also always loved the subtlety of the turbo model. You have this badge on the trunk that says turbo, but it's in the same color as the car, and nothing else on the outside tells you this is an MR2 Turbo. There's no other real way to know except for that little badge, which is shocking considering this car had a 60% power boost over the base model. They gave it all that extra power, and visually it was largely the same. With that said, one other easy way to tell apart a turbo from a standard MR2 is the hood louvers. In back, the turbos had raised hood louvers that were just a little taller and a little more aggressive than the standard car, whose louvers were basically stamped flat into the hood. Otherwise, you weren't really telling apart the turbo. And that was also true of the wheels, which is such an easy way for automakers to distinguish a high-performance car, give it bigger, sportier wheels. Well, the MR2 had these. They're very subtle, they're very basic, and they looked basically the same on the standard and turbo models. Now, in the tuner scene, everybody takes off these wheels, but I personally like them. They were just the right amount of subtle and aggressive, and they certainly look like they belong in the period of this car. And frankly, I just think they're pretty cool. Now, it is worth pointing out that even though the Turbo didn't really distinguish itself with wheels or badging, the MR2 in general was a pretty racy looking car. In fact, people referred to it as a baby Ferrari, both the original MR2 and this one, because of its various design details. Kind of low slung with the T-tops, mid-engine, all characteristics of Ferraris of the day. You also had a big wing in back, as you can see, which helps lend credence to the idea that this is a fast, sporty car. And you have pop-up headlights in front. You turn on the headlights, they pop right up to illuminate where you're going. The key though was when you turn off the headlights, they pop right back down, which creates this wedge-shaped front end, which helped fit in with the baby Ferrari theory of this car's design. Frankly, I always loved how these MR2s looked. They were kind of baby Ferrari, and they had just the right amount of aggressiveness and yet some 90s subtlety too. And next we move on to the inside of the SW20, although I gotta say, the interior of this car is not really quirky or interesting at all. In fact, get in here and you'll mostly notice a lot of 90s Toyota stuff. You can see, for instance, the switch panel on the driver's door, these window switches, the door lock, the mirrors, all that stuff was used on basically every other 90s Toyota. Same deal with the signal stalk, the wiper stalk, the steering wheel, which I think is actually also used in the 4Runner among basically every other 90s Toyota as well. And frankly, that's true of a lot of the stuff in here. The quirks of this car are on the outside, the driving experience, the mid-engine layout, but in here it's just mostly 90s Toyota. Now, with that said, there are a few somewhat interesting things in here. For example, there's some storage behind the seats. You fold the seat forward, you can see this little shelf here where you can put stuff if you want, and there's even a little strap that clips together to keep your stuff in place so it doesn't move around or fall out. You also have the same little storage area behind the passenger seat, as you can see, with the same little clip to keep your stuff in place. And between the seats, between the backrests, you also have, well, more storage. The top of this area opens up. You can lift up the lid where you have a storage compartment, as you can see, or you can open up the front panel and then it reveals some shelves in case you want to stick stuff on the shelves in your Toyota MR2, you have that possibility with this extra storage in here. As for other quirks, like I said, they're pretty sparse, but I like that the parking brake appears to have been an afterthought. Like they designed this whole center console and forgot about the parking brake, and they had to tack it on later, which is kind of funny to see. I also like that there's a climate vent down below the dashboard on the driver's side that specifically blows air onto your legs or your thighs. It's nice to have an extra climate vent there. Some cars did this in the 90s, but unfortunately no longer, but it was a cool idea. I also like that when you open up the sun visor and put it down, you have a special warning label placed here that teaches you how to operate a turbocharged engine, specifically relating to oil changes and temperature, because turbocharging really wasn't that common when this car came out, so they had to explain it to you, a warning label. It's hilarious to think of now when so many cars are turbocharged. You also had in the gauge cluster a little turbo boost gauge front and center, so you could monitor your turbo boost. It was a cool upgrade to an otherwise relatively basic and standard gauge cluster, that little turbo boost gauge that remind you your car was special. All right, driving the SW20 Mr. 2 Turbo. And I gotta say, I've always had a real soft spot for these cars. I remember when I was a kid, I'd see them around. I mean, they weren't that rare back then. They were a new car, and then they became like a slightly used car, and you'd sort of see them on the road. Now they're just completely gone. This wasn't a cool thing, like a rare treat when I was younger, but boy has it become one. They're just not around. I want to start with the clutch and shifter action, because that's basically the first thing you notice when you start driving. The clutch is notchier than I thought. It's not as like linear and progressive, which is a surprise because I feel like the Supra's clutch was pretty linear. This one though, there's a kick to it. You kind of come up a little bit, and then you got to be careful at exactly the right bite point, or else you're going to get a little bit of jerking. Not exactly my favorite clutch. Thankfully it's not heavy, and so that's not really a problem. You could pretty easily modulate it. You know exactly what to do because it's easy to use. It's not quite that smooth and linear until you actually start getting going. And I notice now it's a little bit easier, although still kind of notchy. The thing that's really special about the clutch and shifter though is the way the shifter feels. Unbelievably excellent shifter feel. One of the very best I've ever driven, actually. It's a little shift knob, and so it's not like some long, tall thing. It's got short throws, and it just feels perfectly. Falls perfectly to hand, shifts excellently. I mean, that is exactly what you hope for when you get in a car with a manual transmission, that it shifts like this one does. And driving it around, the first thing you really start to notice is, I mean, it's little, it's tossable, and it's quick. 200 horsepower probably doesn't seem all that much by modern standards, but this car weighs a lot less than anything you'll find in the modern era. It is a light car, and the engine is in the right place, and oh man, this is a lot of fun. The tires are telling me, a little much, but I'm loving this. It's just so tossable. I love cars that are tossable. I love cars that you can throw around. I do not care what the power output is, as long as the car lets you throw it around. And this car is that. Now, steering is nowhere near as precise as a modern car, but in terms of handling, I'll take this over a modern car all day long. It's little, it's low, and it's light. And so you really feel like you're in an immense amount of control of this car, and you know exactly where all of it is at any given moment, and you feel pretty confident doing what you want with it, especially because of that engine in the middle, which makes for excellent weight distribution and gives you even more confidence in the corners. This car is just a hoot to drive. It is a total blast. And I fit in this car. I was a little concerned about that because it's a little car and it comes from Japan where people tend to be littler, but that's not the situation. I fit just fine in here. I'm a reasonably tall person at 6'4", but I got headroom, I got leg room. Actually, the seat is even a little further back than I would want it. Oh, this thing is so much fun. This is such a great reminder. You know, I have these 3 supercars, Ford GT, Carrera GT, and a Countach. This is such a great reminder. You don't need a supercar to have a great time in a car. You just don't. I mean, this car isn't going to turn heads like one of those. It's not as special as one of those. But if you just want to go up to the canyons with your buddies and blast off on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning every couple months, this car would be so much fun for that. Woohoo! Whee! Such confidence in the handling in this car. I just love it. And I love the shifter. Quick and easy revving too, so a rev match is nice and easy to do on a downshift. And then it goes, and by the way, from an acceleration perspective, this car is pretty quick. 0 to 60 I think is like 6 seconds, but it feels faster than that. You're low, it's buzzy, and it's sort of an old school turbo in the sense that it kind of comes on late and really kicks you in the face when it does. What a cool car! And it's a Toyota, so you're not that worried about it. And it's the 3S GTE, which has such a great reputation, both for reliability and extra power if you want to go there, but you don't, because this car has just perfect balance. I think these are undervalued. I think anybody who spends time in one of these and looks out of that rearview mirror and sees that spoiler and takes off the T-tops is going to come away thinking that even as the prices have risen considerably for these over the last couple of years, they're still probably undervalued considering the low production, especially for the turbos, and the wonderful driving experience that this car offers. I love the Mark IV Supra, but this is probably more fun. The Supra is more of a tourer than I think a lot of the internet realizes, but this car is your toss it around, ultra fun, lightweight sports car, and it's really cool. And so that's the SW20 Toyota MR2 Turbo. These have been gaining in enthusiast interest and in value, and with good reason. It's a fantastic old school sports car driving experience. And now it's time to give this MR2 Turbo a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 49 out of 100, placing the MR2 Turbo here against some other similar sports cars from the 1990s. This car is great, and it's more impressive than its mid-90s era and Toyota brand name might suggest. The SW20 Turbo is well-balanced, perfectly sized, shockingly fast, and attractive. It's really got a lot going for it, and then there's the Toyota reliability and its reasonably affordable price tag. I liked this car more than I expected, and I have a suspicion nice ones will continue to rise in value.